he was a king. He locked his wife, the queen, in a stone tower for 16 years to break her will. He thought he had taken everything. Her freedom, her power, her future. But he made one fatal mistake. He left her with a quill and ink. And with it, she didn't write pleas for mercy. She wrote letters of pure venom to her own sons, turning a mother's love into a weapon, and her children into assassins. This is the story of how a queen became a spider, and destroyed her own family to get her revenge. The stone walls of the residence breathed cold even in the height of the summer of 1173. The queen sat by the narrow window, her fingers, accustomed to silk and power, now only stirred the dust on the sill. Muffled sounds of life drifted from outside, the life that had once been hers by right of birth and marriage. Now she was a prisoner, locked away by her own husband, the King of England. Henry II, her second husband, the father of her many children, had confined her to the castle, taking her freedom, but not her will. The sunbeam that pierced the gloom of her chamber was a liar, speaking of a warmth she could not feel. It illuminated the motes of dust dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten moment. She traced the rough-hewn stone of the window frame, the friction a stark contrast to the memory of smoothed ivory and cold gold. Her world had shrunk to these four walls, this single sliver of sky, this silence broken only by the distant, mocking echoes of the world she had once commanded. Outside, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil rang with a purpose she no longer possessed. She could hear the faint shouts of men-at-arms in the bailey, the whinny of a horse eager for a rider. Each sound was a needle prick to her pride, a reminder of the army she had ridden with, the lands she had ruled. She was Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, once Queen of the Franks, now Queen of the English, and she was reduced to listening to the lives of lesser men from behind a wall. Her mind, a place he could not cage, retreated into the past. She saw the soaring vaults of the Abbey of St. Denis, felt the weight of the French crown settling upon her 15-year-old head. She remembered the heat of the Holy Land, a disastrous crusade at the side of her first husband, a pious fool. Then came Henry, all fire and ambition, a man who matched her own desires. He had offered her a new crown, a new kingdom, and sons to inherit it all. The memory of Henry brought a cold fury that was more potent than the chill of the stone. She pictured his face, his Plantagenet temper flaring in his grey eyes. He had accused her of fomenting rebellion, of poisoning their sons against him. He saw her ambition as a threat, her power as a challenge to his own. He had used her to secure his empire, and now that she had given him heirs, he sought to discard her like a worn-out gauntlet. But he had misjudged her. He thought these walls would break her spirit, that solitude would soften her resolve into meek obedience. He did not understand that in this enforced stillness, her mind was only growing sharper, her hatred more focused. She was not withering in this cell, she was gestating. A new kind of power was taking root in the darkness, a power that did not require a throne or an army. She thought of her sons. Young Henry, the heir, crowned but given no authority, a king of shadows. Richard, her lion, ruling her own beloved Aquitaine, his pride surely chafing under his father's constant interference. Geoffrey, the clever one, always watching, always calculating. And even John, the youngest, his father's favorite, a boy who could be molded. They were the keys. They were the swords she could no longer wield herself. A slow, deliberate calm settled over her. The grief for her lost freedom curdled into a plan. He had left her with quill and parchment to write her confessions. He would get confessions, but not the kind he expected. She would write to her sons. Her letters would be her spies, her words the poison in their father's cup. She would spin a web from this tower, a web of whispered suggestions, of stoked resentments, of carefully cultivated ambition. The queen rose from the window. The light caught the silver threads in her hair, not as a sign of age, but as the first strands of a spider's silk. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a strategist, her cell a command tent. Henry had built her a prison, but in his arrogance, he had also given her a fortress from which to wage the most intimate and devastating of wars. The battle for the Angevin crown would not be fought on the fields of France, but in the hearts of a father and his sons. Within these walls, where time flowed slowly, like thick honey, she was transformed into something else. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of light through the high window. The monotony that should have dulled her senses instead sharpened them. She learned the map of cracks on the ceiling, the subtle variations in the chimes of the distant chapel bell, the scuttling of mice in the walls. Bitterness and a thirst for revenge became her food. They were a more potent sustenance than the bland meals left by a silent guard. The injustice of her confinement was a fire in her belly, a heat that the damp stones could not quench. Every memory was now re-examined through the lens of this final betrayal, every past kindness from her husband reinterpreted as a calculated maneuver. She nursed her rage, keeping it pure and strong. She remembered her life, a tapestry woven with threads of gold and blood. She saw herself at 15 years, a girl from the vibrant South, made queen of the pious, grey Franks. The crown had been heavy, the court stifling, her husband Louis more a monk than a king. She had yearned for a life larger than the one prescribed for her, a desire that was seen not as ambition but as a flaw in her character. Her mind traveled east, to the sun-scorched lands of Outremer. She felt the heat of the desert, heard the clash of steel during that ill-fated crusade. She had ridden with her armies, a duchess in her own right, only to be undermined and ignored. It was there she first truly understood that a woman's power, even a queen's, was a fragile thing, easily dismissed by proud and foolish men. Then came the divorce, a scandal that had rocked Christendom, and the new marriage that followed with scandalous haste. Henry had been a storm, a force of nature. He was young, vital, and his ambition burned as brightly as her own. Their union was not one of mere convenience, it was a conflagration, a merging of power that created an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. She had given him England's crown and, more importantly, she had given him sons. 5 of them survived to manhood, each a prince, a potential king, a duke. She had fulfilled her highest duty, not just as a wife but as a queen, securing the Plantagenet line for generations. She had poured her strength, her wealth from Aquitaine, and her political acumen into the foundation of his reign. Yet even that was not enough to protect her from his wrath and jealousy. As her sons grew, so did Henry's paranoia. He saw her influence over them, her unbreakable bond with Richard, her beloved Aquitaine's heir. He saw her as a rival, a second sun in a sky that he believed should contain only one. Her power was a threat he could no longer tolerate. The final insult was not political but personal. A younger, softer woman had captured his heart, the one known as Fair Rosamond. While Eleanor aged, bearing his children and managing his lands, he had built a new life in secret. Her imprisonment was not just the act of a king securing his power, it was the act of a husband discarding a wife he no longer desired. This humiliation was the sharpest spur of all. Now her only weapon was letters, secretly conveyed from her prison. The acquisition of parchment and ink was a small victory, a triumph of will over circumstance. A sympathetic chambermaid, a guard whose family owed allegiance to Aquitaine, the means were less important than the result. In the flickering candlelight, the cramped chamber became her council room, her war office. She wrote not as a mother pleading for rescue, but as a sovereign asserting her rights. Her quill scratched across the page, the sound barely audible, yet each word was a stone being laid for the foundation of a rebellion. She chose her language with the care of a master poisoner mixing a draught, a little truth here, a little flattery there, all steeped in the potent brew of grievance. To young Henry, the junior king, she wrote of glory and stolen authority. She reminded him that he wore a crown but held no power, that his father treated him as a child, hoarding every scrap of real governance for himself. She painted a picture of a kingdom that should be his, a destiny that his father was actively denying him. She stoked the fires of his youthful pride and impatience. For Richard, her Lionheart, her Aquitanian son, her words were different. She spoke of his birthright, of the lands of his mother being controlled by his father. She reminded him of his oaths to his own people, people who looked to him as their true duke. She invoked his warrior spirit, questioning how a man of his prowess could bow to a father who showed him so little trust. To Geoffrey, the clever, ambitious Duke of Brittany, she appealed to his intellect. She laid out the political landscape, the alliances that could be forged, the weaknesses in their father's position. She showed him a path to greater power, a role in a new order where his cunning would be valued and rewarded, not viewed with suspicion as it was by the old king. Even for John, the youngest, his father's pet, she had a message. It was a subtle one, a seed of doubt planted about the future. She hinted that a father who could imprison his wife could just as easily change his mind about a favored son's inheritance. She made him question the very foundation of the love he took for granted. Each letter was a carefully crafted instrument of discord. She never explicitly commanded them to rebel. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she presented them with a narrative of injustice, a litany of their father's tyrannies, both personal and political. She made their own ambitions seem like a righteous cause, their nascent resentments a noble calling. The letters were smuggled out, passed from hand to hand, making their way across the channel. Each one that successfully left her prison was a battle won. She could not see their effect, could not hear the arguments they would cause in the courts of her sons. She could only send her words into the darkness and trust in the poison she had so carefully distilled. She was no longer Eleanor, the captive queen. She was the spider at the center of a vast and growing web. The strands were invisible, spun from ink and parchment, but they were stronger than any iron chain. They reached out from her stone cell in Salisbury, stretching to Normandy, to Aquitaine, to Brittany. And she waited, with a patience born of 16 years of solitude, for the inevitable vibrations that would tell her the flies had been caught. She wrote to her sons. The quill felt light in her hand, a feather against the weight of the crown she no longer wore. Yet this feather, she knew, could be wielded as a sword. Each stroke was a calculated thrust, each word a drop of carefully measured poison. Her first missives were for young Henry. She began not with maternal affection but with regal formality. She addressed him as Henry, King of the English, letting the title sit on the page, magnificent and hollow. It was the first turn of the knife, a reminder of the gap between his title and his truth. "You were the crown your father placed upon your head," she wrote. "Does it feel as light as a fool's cap? He made you a king to secure his own legacy, not to begin yours. You are the symbol of his power, not the wielder of your own. Every lord that bows to you is bowing to him through you." She painted his court as a gilded cage, much like her own stone one. "Your friends are his spies, your counselors his mouthpieces. He gives you palaces but no estates to fund them, an army but no command to lead it. You are a king who must ask his father for pocket money." She reminded him of his coronation oath, the promises he made to his people. How can you be a guardian of justice when you have no power to enact it? Your father rules, and you are left to preside over tournaments and feasts, a master of ceremonies while the kingdom's work is done by another. Then she twisted the knife. She spoke of his wife, the French princess, a daughter of her own former husband. You are a king, and she a queen, yet you cannot even grant her the lands promised in her dowry without your father's permission. He demeans you in the eyes of your own wife, in the eyes of France. For Richard, her favorite, her Aquitanian lion, the tone was different. Here, the words flowed from a deeper well, mixing love with a warrior's incitement. "To my son, Duke of Aquitaine," she began, a title that was his through her, not his father. A reminder of where his true loyalty should lie. "Your father wages his wars in the north with the wealth of your duchy. He mortgages the vineyards of Gascony and the fields of Poitou to pay for his castles in Normandy. He sells your birthright, piece by piece, to fund his own ambitions, without a thought for yours or for the legacy of your ancestors." She wrote of Aquitaine not as a territory, but as a living thing. She spoke of its unique laws, its proud people, its vibrant culture of poets and troubadours. "These are your people, Richard. They look to you, their duke, not to some distant English king who sees their home as a treasure chest to be plundered." She invoked his honor, the quality he prized above all others. "He asks you to be his general, to fight his battles and tame his rebellious barons. But when the fighting is done, he reaps the rewards. You win the victory, and he collects the fealty. How long will the lion fetch sticks for his master?" And she made it personal, a wound only a mother could inflict. "He keeps me from you, and you from me. He fears the love between us because he knows it is a bond of strength he cannot control. The king who holds your mother prisoner cannot be a father you should trust." Geoffrey, her third son, the Duke of Brittany, received a different kind of letter entirely. There was no appeal to pride or sentiment. Her words to him were cold, hard, and logical, a chess master laying out the board. She respected his cunning mind, and so she addressed it directly. "Your father plays you and your brothers against each other. He gives you Brittany through marriage, but he holds the reins of its power tightly. He uses you as a check against Richard, and Richard as a check against the young king. You are all merely pieces in his game." She pointed to the future, to the one son who seemed to be winning this subtle contest. "Look at how he favors John," she wrote. "He has given him the title Lord of Ireland and castles that should have belonged to his older brothers. John is the youngest, but he is being groomed for a power that will diminish your own." She laid out the political calculus of rebellion. "France will support you," she wrote, "for King Louis is ever eager to see the Angevin Empire tear itself apart. The barons of the north are restless. Your brother Henry is chafing for power, and Richard's sword is sworn to Aquitaine. The moment is ripe." She did not ask for his loyalty based on love, but on self-interest. "A future under your father is one of perpetual subordination. A future forged with your brothers, however, could see you as the master of your own destiny, a true ruler of Brittany, beholden to no one. Think on this. Use the mind God gave you." Even for John, the boy, the father's darling, she had a message. This was the most delicate work, a single seed of doubt planted in the fertile soil of a child's love. Her letter was short, almost an afterthought, disguised as a mother's lament. "I hear your father dotes on you, calls you his treasure. It warms my heart to know one of my sons is happy. But a king's favor, my child, can be as changeable as the weather. He loved me once, too. He gave me a crown, and now he gives me these stone walls." She offered no advice, made no requests. She simply held up a mirror to the boy's idyllic situation, showing him a darker reflection. A father who is capable of such cruelty to his wife is capable of anything. Pray that his love for you is stronger than his love of power ever was. It was enough. And with every letter sent, she mentioned the insult that bound them all together. She spoke of the king's mistress, the harlot at Woodstock. "He keeps another woman in a sunlit palace while your mother, the anointed Queen of England, languishes in a tower. It is an offense against God, and an insult to the honor of all my sons." She wove the poison into every line. The injustice of their father, his infidelity, the theft of their inheritance. She did not command them to act. She merely provided the reasons, stoked the embers of their own resentment, and gave their ambition a righteous cause. She turned their love for her into a weapon against their father. The ink dried on the parchment. The messages were sealed and passed into the shadows, carried by loyal hands across the sea. In her cell, there was only silence again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of the spider who has finished her web and waits, patiently, for the trembling to begin. Her words fell on fertile ground. They traveled not as simple ink on parchment, but as sparks landing in barrels of gunpowder. The letters arrived by different means, carried by a trusted friar or a merchant whose loyalties lay with the old duchy. Each son received his in a different setting, yet the effect was brutally the same. Young Henry was at court in Normandy, presiding over a tournament. He broke the seal in his tent, the sounds of celebration outside suddenly feeling hollow and absurd. His mother's words confirmed every bitter thought he had ever harbored in secret. He was a king in name, a puppet in fact. The parchment crumpled in his fist. He looked out at the knights jousting for his favor, a favor he had no real power to grant. His father had given him a crown but kept the kingdom. He was a gilded ornament, a symbol of a succession that might never truly come. The shame burned hotter than any sun. His resentment finally hardened into purpose. Richard was in Aquitaine, inspecting the garrison of a newly fortified castle. He read his mother's missive under the harsh southern sun, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The words about his mortgaged lands and his imprisoned mother were not a plea, but a battle cry. It was an appeal to his very soul. His gray eyes, so like his father's, turned to flint. This was his land, his inheritance through her. To see it used as a bank for his father's northern wars was an insult to his honor and his love for her. He had been a loyal son for too long. Now, he would be a loyal duke. His fealty to Aquitaine came first. Geoffrey received his letter in Brittany, in the quiet of his study. He read it not once, but 3 times. He felt no surge of rage or shame like his brothers. Instead, a cold, clear logic descended upon him. His mother had not written a letter, she had presented a political thesis, and its conclusion was inescapable. He saw the alliances she hinted at, the weaknesses she exposed. He saw the favor shown to John, a threat to all the older brothers. His mother was right. A future under his father was a slow political strangulation. A future forged in rebellion was a gamble, but one that offered the prize of true sovereignty. He folded the letter and began to plan. The sons, already dissatisfied with their father and seeing him as an obstacle to their own greatness, heeded her calls. Secret messages began to fly between Normandy, Aquitaine, and Brittany. The brothers, so often rivals, were now united by a shared sense of grievance, a common enemy, and the ghost of their mother's will. The first move was made in the winter of 1173. On the pretext of joining their father, young Henry and Richard traveled to his court at Chinon. There, they made their final, impossible demands for sovereign power over their appointed lands. The refusal was as swift and absolute as they had expected. That night, they fled. They rode hard for the French court, for the open arms of King Louis VII, their father's greatest rival and young Henry's father-in-law. Geoffrey soon followed. The flight was not the act of petulant boys, it was a declaration of war, a severing of the most sacred feudal and familial bonds. A rebellion began, an uprising of children against their father, fueled from behind bars by their mother. King Louis, delighted at this turn of events, formally recognized young Henry as the true King of England and promised him aid. Powerful barons, long resentful of Henry II's strong hand and legal reforms, saw their chance. The great Earls of Chester, Leicester, and Norfolk declared for the young king. The King of Scots saw an opportunity to invade the north. The Count of Flanders promised an army to land in the east. Eleanor's invisible web had now become a vast net of alliances, all closing in on her husband, the king. The country plunged into internecine war. Banners that had once flown side by side were now arrayed against each other. Knights who had been brothers in arms now sharpened their blades for each other's throats. The dispute was not over land or titles, but over the very nature of the family that ruled it all. Fields went unplanted as men were called to arms. Villages were burned in punitive raids. The king's justice, once the pride of the realm, collapsed as local lords chose sides. The conflict was a deep, bleeding wound in the heart of the Angevin Empire, a sickness that had started in the royal bedchamber. And in her various prisons, moved from castle to prevent any rescue attempt, Eleanor waited. News came in whispers and fragments, a guard's careless comment, a line in a letter from a loyalist. She heard of the siege of Rouen, of Richard's campaigns in Aquitaine, of the Scottish invasion. Each piece of news was a vindication. She felt no remorse, only a cold, grim satisfaction. She had known her sons, known their pride and their ambition. She had known her husband, known his arrogance and his temper. She had simply introduced the flame to the kindling and watched from her window as the blaze grew. The shadow of the Spider Queen hung over the kingdom. Though she was unseen, her presence was felt everywhere. Men fought and died for a cause she had articulated. A dynasty was tearing itself apart based on the resentments she had so carefully nurtured. She was the still point at the center of the storm she had created. Henry II, a man of boundless energy, fought back with all the fury of a betrayed father and a cornered king. He hired mercenaries, rallied his loyal vassals, and crisscrossed his empire with astonishing speed, putting down one fire only for another to erupt elsewhere. But this was a war he could not win with armies alone. For he was not fighting the King of France or the Count of Flanders. He was fighting his own past, his own mistakes, his own blood. He was fighting the ghost of his marriage, a specter his wife had unleashed upon him from the confines of a stone cell. The greatest monarch in Europe was being brought to his knees by family. 16 years she spent in captivity, but her spirit remained unbroken. The seasons turned outside her window, a slow, indifferent parade. The first great rebellion had failed, crushed by her husband's relentless energy. Her sons had been forced to kneel and beg for a humiliating forgiveness. Her own confinement became stricter, her world smaller. Yet she was not broken. A bent bow is not a broken one, it is a bow that holds tension. The years of solitude did not soften her resolve but tempered it, burning away all that was not essential. Hope was a luxury, but will was a necessity. She cultivated her will as a gardener tends a single, poisonous plant in a locked courtyard. The years passed, bringing news of battles, betrayals, and deaths. The world beyond her walls was a tapestry of violence and intrigue, and she could only read its story through the frayed threads of rumor that reached her. She learned to interpret the silences of her guards, the haste of a priest, the quality of the bread she was served. Her sons, though forgiven, were never trusted again. The family was a constellation of resentful stars, each circling the fading son of their father, each pulling on the other. The war had not ended, it had simply moved inward, becoming a sickness of the soul that poisoned every feast and every council. Then came the news that struck her like a physical blow. In the year 1183, her eldest son, Henry the young king, was dead. He had died not in a glorious battle for his crown, but ignominiously of dysentery during yet another petty rebellion. The designated heir, the cornerstone of her original strategy, was gone. A lesser woman would have seen this as God's judgment, a sign of her failure. Eleanor allowed herself the cold, private grief of a mother, a pain that echoed in the hollow spaces of her cell. But the queen within her saw something else. She saw a board reset, a piece removed. Her rage at the waste of it all was a cold, clean thing. But even that did not stop her. The loss of her firstborn did not end her war, it merely changed its nature. The rebellion no longer had a single, clear figurehead. Now, her hopes and her machinations focused with an even greater intensity on the one who remained her favorite, Richard. He was now the heir. She continued to spin her web, though the strands had to be finer, more subtle. Her letters to Richard were no longer about immediate revolt, but about the slow, patient consolidation of power. She advised him on his administration of Aquitaine, encouraging him to be a strong and just duke, to win the love of his people. She knew this would create its own conflict. A strong and popular Duke of Aquitaine would inevitably be seen as a threat by the King of England. She was not fanning the flames of war but carefully, deliberately, building a pyre and waiting for his father to provide the spark that would set it ablaze. She watched from afar as her other sons circled each other. Geoffrey, ever the schemer, played his own games in Brittany, a constant thorn in his father's side until he was trampled to death in a tournament. Another piece removed from the board. Now only Richard and John remained as significant players. And Henry, her husband, grew old. The boundless energy began to fade. He became more obsessed, more paranoid. He poured his affection and his hopes onto his youngest, John, the son who had never rebelled. He dallied with the idea of making John his heir, of disinheriting the proud and defiant Richard. This was the spark Eleanor had been waiting for. The whispers of Richard's potential disinheritance were all the cause he needed. The final act began not with a letter from her, but with the inevitable clash of two titanic wills, the aging king and the son who was his mirror in all things but loyalty. The final war was swift and brutal. Richard, now a seasoned warrior and a respected commander, made an alliance with the new, young king of France, Philip Augustus. Together, they were a force his father could no longer match. The old lion was outmaneuvered, his barons deserting him for the rising son of his son. News reached her of battles, of cities falling. Le Mans, his own birthplace, was taken and burned. Then Tours. The king, her husband, was in flight, a fugitive in his own lands, hunted by his own flesh and blood. She felt a tremor of something profound, the culmination of a 16-year vendetta. And then, finally, in the summer of 1189, the last messenger arrived. Her jailer, her husband, Henry II, was dead. He had been forced to a humiliating peace, agreeing to all of Richard's terms. As a final cruelty, he had demanded a list of those who had conspired against him. The first name on the list was that of his beloved son, John. The shock of this final betrayal, they said, was what had killed him. He had turned his face to the wall and died, broken and betrayed, his last words a curse upon the sons he had created. In her chamber, Eleanor stood very still. 16 years. It was over. There was no elation, no shout of triumph. There was only the quiet, immense satisfaction of a plan brought to its perfect, devastating conclusion. Her husband was dead. Her favorite son was King of England. And the door to her cage was finally open. Released by her beloved son, now King Richard I, Eleanor regained power. The heavy oak door of her chamber did not fly open, it was unbarred with a quiet, final click. The light that spilled in was not blinding. It was the ordinary light of an ordinary day, but to her it was a revelation. She stepped out not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Her first breath of free air in 16 years was cool and smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke. It was the scent of the world, and she drank it in. Her body, accustomed to the confines of a cell, felt strange in the open space of the castle bailey. But her mind, which had never been confined, expanded at once to fill the borders of her son's new kingdom. The reunion with Richard was one of sovereigns. There were tears, but they were the tears of allies who had won a long and bitter war. She looked at him, no longer a boy but a king in the prime of his life, a warrior forged in the fires she had lit. He saw in her not a frail, rescued mother, but the architect of his victory, his most trusted adviser. She did not rest. Power, once regained, must be immediately exercised. She rode from the castle not to a quiet convent, but to Westminster. She issued decrees in Richard's name, her name. She proclaimed a general amnesty, releasing those her husband had unjustly imprisoned. It was a masterstroke, winning the hearts of the people and asserting her authority in a single act. She ruled England while her son, his crown barely settled on his head, made his preparations to leave. His heart was not in England, it was in the Holy Land, set on a crusade to win glory and redeem Jerusalem. She did not try to dissuade him. She understood a king's need for a grand purpose, just as she understood a kingdom's need for a steady hand. She stood on the docks and watched his fleet sail away. There was pride, but no sentimentality. She was now the regent, the ruler of the vast Angevin lands in all but name. The challenges were immense. Her youngest son, John, circled the throne like a hungry wolf. The King of France watched from across the Channel, eager to devour their continental lands. The years of Richard's absence were a masterclass in statecraft. She played a delicate game of diplomacy and veiled threats. She placated restless barons, managed the kingdom's finances, and checkmated John's clumsy attempts at rebellion at every turn. Her age was not a weakness, it was a weapon. She had seen it all, and there was no scheme she could not anticipate. Then came the catastrophic news. On his way back from the Holy Land, Richard had been captured, imprisoned by the Duke of Austria, and sold to the Holy Roman Emperor. The Lionheart was in a cage, and the price for his freedom was set at a figure designed to bankrupt the realm, 150,000 marks. Once again, she did not despair. She acted. Her rage was a cold, efficient force. She levied unprecedented taxes, demanding a quarter of all income from every man, cleric, and layman. She sent letters to every corner of the kingdom, her seal carrying the full weight of the crown and a mother's fierce will. She stripped the churches of their gold and silver plate, promising to repay it. She shamed and cajoled the great lords, reminding them of their feudal oaths. For 2 years, she turned the entire kingdom into an instrument for one single purpose, to raise the ransom. It was the greatest administrative feat of her life, a monument to her unbending resolve. She outlived him. After his release, Richard returned to his endless wars in France and was cut down by a crossbow bolt outside a minor castle. The news found her at Fontevraud, the abbey she had chosen for her retirement. She had buried a son who died of sickness, another trampled in a tournament. Now she buried the king, her favorite. She grieved, but even in grief, she was a politician. She moved swiftly to secure the succession for her last remaining son, John, not out of any love for him, but to preserve the dynasty. She fought one last campaign, securing Aquitaine for him, a woman in her late 70s riding at the head of an army. She lived to see John lose it all. She watched from her abbey as Normandy, Anjou, the lands she and Henry had forged into an empire, were lost to the French king. It was the final, bitter irony. The great work of her life, undone by the incompetence of the son she had never trusted. She had outlived her children and now she was outliving her empire. She lived to be 82 years old. In the quiet halls of the abbey, the decades fell away. She was once again the Duchess of Aquitaine, the Queen of France, the Queen of England. She had been a wife, a mother, a prisoner, and a ruler. She had loved and she had hated with a power that shaped nations. As she lay dying in the Abbey of Fontevraud, her effigy was already being carved. It was to be placed in the crypt, beside the tomb of the men she had hated most in all the world. She would lie next to her husband, Henry, for eternity. There was no horror in this, only a sense of profound and final victory. She knew, in her last moments, that her true passion had not been for a man or a child, but for power itself. It was the thread that had run through her entire existence. She had held it, lost it, and reclaimed it against all odds. It had remained with her until the very end, a prize she had secured with the only currency that mattered, the blood of her own family.